They might be facing a difficult task, but in my opinion, many of the members of the Baseball Writers Association of America have completely lost the thread over the past few years. Their refusal to be consistent is eroding any remaining credibility for what was once the most sacred shrine in American sports. Let's start with a comparison of two players. Both were superstars, both have been on the ballot in recent years, and both almost certainly committed the same crime. Presented with the relevant evidence, I think any rational person would conclude that these players both used performance-enhancing drugs, but the Hall of Fame voters haven't given the time of day to one and instantly fell in love with the other. First, consider the case of Sammy Sosa, whose home run numbers at his best were so otherworldly that we think of his innocence as impossible. In the years since, he barked at Rick Riley, he wilted in Washington, he almost apologized, and he almost admitted, but neither he nor anyone else has ever produced a true smoking gun. The only tangible evidence of Sosa's doping comes in the form of a survey test in 2003, which MLB and its commissioner have repeatedly discredited, and which also took down presumptive future inductee David Ortiz. Let's be clear. There is so much circumstantial evidence here that I cannot fathom any impartial observer coming to a conclusion other than that Sosa used, but this is an assumption we've all come to rather than a fact that we can prove. Based on his results thus far, he has no shot to make it, now or ever. Next, consider the case of Ivan Pudge Rodriguez. While Pudge was still playing, the surprisingly credible Jose Canseco provided us with a description of a younger Pudge being taught how to use steroids, alongside teammates Rafael Palmeiro and Juan Gonzalez. Upon the implementation of drug testing, Pudge conveniently shed a stone or two in one off-season, and upon questioning gave us a sly only God knows. Lucky enough not to be called to Congress, smart enough to pull the plug in time for testing, and a great enough all-around player at a key defensive position, Pudge was voted in on his first try. You could tell me that Pudge was a more well-rounded player, and I would agree with you. You could tell me that PED use is more responsible for Sosa's Hall credentials than Pudge, and I would also agree with you. You could tell me that maybe there are more angles, a few more pieces of circumstantial evidence against Sosa than against Pudge, and maybe I would agree with you too, but I'll counter and tell you that were it not for this topic specifically, both would be in the Hall of Fame, and nobody ever wrote an eyewitness account of a young Sammy shooting up. Although they could not have been more different, as players or people, these two men find themselves in the same PED-infested boat. Based on the evidence we have, the overwhelmingly likely conclusion is that both players did it. We don't know that both players did it because that would require them to be caught or for them to admit. But presented with this information, a rational mind can't help but conclude that both of these players almost certainly used. Yet they're not confirmed, they haven't confessed. There could still be people somewhere who find ways to question the particularly damning charges against each one. There's somebody out there who will still point out that Sosa's 2003 test is not a valid indictment because Manfred says there were false positives, and that Canseco is not a valid source because he's a space cadet. Therefore, we can't say we know. We can only say we think that these guys did it, with a likelihood of 99 some odd percent, but not quite 100. And evidently, this matters. With the singular exception of Sosa, whose case has never received any benefit of the doubt, Hall of Fame voters have set the following precedent. They're willing to vote for players who likely did steroids. They're willing to vote for players who very likely did steroids. They are willing to vote for a player like Pudge, who really almost certainly did steroids, but they're not willing to vote for a player who certainly did. That is their line of demarcation. I will grant you that one individual voter might have a completely different outlook on this issue from another. There are a few large blocks of voters that have always existed, and then there are the nuanced takes. Then, there are also plenty of ballots which are downright bizarre and lead me to question whether the writers researched the candidates at all. And to that point, I've got to take a second to rant about 2021's strangest Hall of Fame voting trend, the Sheffield yes bonds no voter. I am sure many of them would argue Sheff used the cream by mistake, as he claims, and I'm equally sure most of them are completely unaware that the Balco Fallout unearthed calendars detailing his use of synthetic testosterone and growth hormone from 2002. The first prerequisite for a nuanced opinion is knowing the facts. In any case, generally speaking, the actual inductions and voting results in the past decade have shown us that there is a world of difference in the minds of many voters between those we think are extremely likely but not certain to have used PEDs and those we think we know used PEDs. Voters of this mindset will remind us that a tenet of our justice system is innocence until proven guilty. I find that ironic because once all the dust settled, that very justice system found neither Roger Clemens nor Barry Bonds to be guilty after all. That's not saying they didn't do it. Look, they very obviously did. And moreover, neither one is a moral saint away from the game either. Even writers who don't care about this issue at all might have to hold their noses to check those boxes. But here is a really important point. By this standard, a Jeff Bagwell or a Mike Piazza or an Ivan Rodriguez might only be in the Hall of Fame by dumb luck. This is crude and I'm sorry, but if I think both of them did PEDs, what's the difference between Jeff Bagwell, who's in, and Gary Sheffield, who's not? The difference is that Gary Sheffield is the unlucky one, whose supplier got caught in the act. It could very well be as simple as that. The Bagwell-Sheffield thought experiment, by the way, works just as well with any number of other combinations of players. If you don't think Bagwell did it, you can pick your inducted suspect of choice, perhaps even someone outside the big three of recent enshrinees. The obvious problem was demonstrated by Canseco when he lashed out at Tom Verducci for voting for Bagwell. What we have here is a crime that by many accounts was very common in baseball, unpunished by baseball, and uninvestigated by baseball until the early 2000s. Years after the fact, a certain portion of the players who engaged in that crime, probably nowhere close to a majority, happened to get caught, whether by the Mitchell Report, Operation Equine, the Balco raid, or otherwise admitting to it themselves. Those players can now only watch as others who did the same but happened not to get caught get voted into the Hall of Fame. The difference between one group and the other might just come down to dumb luck. And of course, the same thing can happen in court, and we say it's okay because it prevents innocents from being punished unfairly. But seeing as the Hall of Fame is not a court of law and we're not dealing with imprisonment or sentences, why should this logic apply to both processes? The voter who casts a ballot for any of the aforementioned trio in the past few years, but who does not vote for Bonds and Clemens, is putting their ballot up to a chance, and given the era in question, it's not a good one. That voter is hoping that just maybe their guy was the exception rather than the rule. After all, between 1995 and 2007, players either in the Mitchell Report or who later admitted to PED use won 13 MVPs. That is just the full confirmed total. That figure does not count Sammy Sosa, Pudge Rodriguez, or Ryan Howard, who was named in the Al Jazeera piece on doping. The obvious conclusion here is that there was a period of time, lasting at least a decade, during which most of the top players in baseball were taking performance-enhancing drugs, surely including many other guys who were never caught. I do have to take a second to consider the counter-argument, the plight of the non-user. Even though he was pretty one-dimensional, I'll be happy when the Today's Game Committee elects Fred McGriff in the coming years, because I tend to think he didn't do it, and he was such a likable and entertaining player. Assuming he was clean, he's pretty unlucky, because were it not for the feats of his enhanced contemporaries, he would have been voted in by the writers years ago. But his induction will come. They'll love him on that committee. What about the others who have it worse? It does pain me to imagine the clean player on the outside who follows these votes and wonders if maybe the reason he's not in the hall is because he didn't use. Maybe the Kenny Lofton, the John Olerud, the Will Clark, your skinny 90s star of choice. That doesn't sit well. That's why this is so difficult. I truly think this is as good a justification as any for the continued existence of the Veterans Committee. But is this truly a unique situation in baseball history? What about the hitter who played naked in the 70s, or the pitcher today who doesn't use a foreign substance? No, we don't cry for them, because we view steroid use as a more evil form of cheating than everything that came before. There's something that feels more wrong about it, the concept of a player injecting himself with substances designed to make him bigger and stronger than he can naturally become. It's illegal for starters, and it's viscerally disturbing, in a way that makes a pitcher rubbing pine tar between his fingers seem almost wholesome in comparison. And we think, perhaps justifiably, that even if both things were means to the same end, those steroids did more for their consumers than greenies ever did. And yeah, there's literally a statistical footprint of the steroid year in the record books. There's good reason to believe that Sammy Sosa's home run totals between 1998 and 2001 are actually impossible for a natural athlete. Anyone who comes close is suspicious, fairly or otherwise. Barring a true outcomes hell, history tells us no one should be able to duplicate what Sammy Sosa did. Does that make his steroid use that much more wrong than the amphetamines that Stargell, Mays, and other Hall of Famers were using? I'm not sure it does. All of these things are definitely cheating, as is scuffing the baseball, pitching with foreign substances, sign-stealing systems, etc. Many of these things have been widespread around the game at various times. Are we just supposed to pick the ones that worked the best and then label those as the most morally reprehensible? If I had a vote, I'm actually not sure I would check Sammy Sosa's box. I don't say that because of his steroid use per se. I say that because he only had one Hall of Fame caliber tool, which he would not have had if not for his presumptive use of PEDs. Furthermore, I'm not a big fan of automatic numbers, such as 600 homers as a Cooperstown benchmark, if the package isn't otherwise excellent. He was an icon and a part of the history of the game, but as part of that history is every bit as much the result of multiple scandals as it is a result of his greatness. Nevertheless, I do think Sammy's candidacy is a perfect example of the inconsistency with which the baseball writers have approached this problem. I am no more confident that Sosa used steroids than I am about Ivan Rodriguez. That is to say, I'm extremely confident that both of them did, and I think everyone else who does any research should be too. I don't know that they did, but I'm about as close as can be without being there. And on the same voting cycle which inducted Pudge, Sammy received less than 9%. Many people who categorically oppose the induction of PED-linked players into the Hall of Fame cite the character, integrity, and sportsmanship clauses in the voting guidelines. Those clauses do exist in the sense that the words character, integrity, and sportsmanship appear as noun clauses as part of this sentence. This to me says that a player's sins should be taken into account, and I absolutely agree. But there are some out there, such as Brian Kenny and Tom Verducci, who will read this to indicate that any player who ever touched a PED once should be out of the Hall of Fame. And I think this phrasing is way too vague to be interpreted that way. So given how ambiguous the voting guidelines are, I'm left to believe the only guidepost we have is precedent. Precedent says you can't bet on baseball or fix the results of the game if you want to get to Cooperstown. But it also says that cheating of many forms has often been tolerated in the Hall of Fame. Maybe steroid use is a more controversial form, but we have known and accepted the use of PEDs of other kinds for decades. Only once we see the hallowed records fall, thus proving that this form of cheating is more effective, do we turn around and call the use of these particular drugs a heinous crime. No one actually wants to vote for a cheater, myself included. For years, my instinct was that no connected player should sniff the Hall of Fame. Doping is wrong, and it should be taken under consideration when evaluating a candidate, as per the voting guidelines. In a case like Sosa's, where incredibly inauthentic power numbers are the primary drivers of a Hall of Fame argument, steroid suspicion might hold him down in a way that presumed innocence lifts a Fred McGriff up. But I've come to believe that the idea that all PED use should be flatly disqualifying, while other forms of cheating are unpunished, and several extremely likely offenders already have plaques, is really sanctimonious and difficult to justify. So with all of this in mind, let's finally talk about the greatest and most controversial of them all. Do we know that Barry Bonds used steroids? We know that he admitted using the cream in the clear, and he claimed not to know what he was taking. We think he did much more than that. For good reason, too. There are chapters written about his steroid use, there are eyewitness accounts of his steroid use, and there are hints in his body, behavior, and performance that point to steroid use. Most of these things also exist for Ivan Rodriguez. The biggest difference I can think of is the inordinate amount of tax money that this country wasted trying to catch Bonds for it. I don't mean to throw Pudge under the bus, by the way. He was always very well regarded within baseball, both as a player and as a person. Taking his career on face value, Ivan Rodriguez is one of the 4 or 5 greatest catchers of all time and a true Hall of Famer. But Barry Bonds on face value is one of the 4 or 5 greatest players of all time. And only one of these careers has been taken on face value by the voters. Now, a lot of people out there support Bonds with the rationale that he was a Hall of Famer before he ever touched steroids. That's probably true, but I wouldn't bet my life on it, because that assumes that he was squeaky clean before 1999, And speaking with that degree of certainty about the innocence of a power-hitting, egomaniacal baseball superstar in such a dirty era seems a bit much to me. Obviously, he went all in at the turn of the millennium, but how do I guarantee that he never dabbled before that? It was the 90s after all. But here's the thing. By not electing Barry Bonds, or Clemens for that matter, and electing Pudge Rodriguez, voters have indicated they don't care about inducting the best players in the history of the game. And they don't care about moral consistency either. Honestly, they seem to care most about optics. A few years ago, the Hall of Fame's board of directors unilaterally shortened the eligibility limits on modern players. That timing's not a coincidence. They chose to fight against Bonds being inducted because it would look bad. Meanwhile, Pudge's steroid use is less known. It's almost plausibly deniable, but not really. I mean, the guy who knows more about steroid use in baseball than anyone, and who's been proven right numerous times now, told us that he helped Pudge do it, and other circumstantial evidence backs up this claim. That doesn't make Rodriguez not a Hall of Famer. It just makes the exclusion of other vastly superior players on this basis indefensible. So in my mind, picking and choosing to vote for Pudge and not Sosa, or Bagwell and not Sheffield, or Sheffield and not Bonds, is just guesswork. Congratulations to the lucky bunch who never got caught. Except, of course, unlucky Sammy Sosa. Barry Bonds is not the best human, or wasn't at least during his playing days, and he absolutely cheated at baseball. These things are true of many inducted players, by the way. Bonds was better than pretty much all of them. Perhaps he would not have become a true immortal if he had stayed clean, but you cannot argue with 400, or with 3 90s MVPs in 4 years, or with 8 gold gloves well backed by modern metrics. I can support those who refuse to vote for a Manny Ramirez, Rafael Palmeiro, Mark McGwire, even an Alex Rodriguez, but not this guy. Some say it would be unprecedented to vote him and Clemens into the Hall of Fame. That is all optics again. Historically, I think their exclusion would be even more unprecedented. And finally, wouldn't it be perfect, in kind of a let the world burn sort of way, if one of these days a Hall of Famer who used steroids just decided to admit it? Maybe then these writers would finally have to face the truth. PEDs are in the Hall of Fame and have been for a while now. I'd love to see it. Unfortunately, I think the inductees are a bit too proud to do that. The National Baseball Hall of Fame is not heaven, and never has been. Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, despite their sins against both baseball and the world, should absolutely be in it. And as they fade from the ballot, so too will fade the credibility of this once hallowed institution.